Sarah, that Steve gave a really good. Okay.
Yes, sorry, go ahead, Dr. Shaw.
I was just going to say, Steve gave a
Yeah.
really good talk to our roundtable group of the CCCA about those bills, and it is important to note that because they've in some ways been snuck through,
Yeah.
and they are going to have an impact because if insofar as the government wants that kind of control, they have built themselves the legislation to allow that.
Right.
So they'll have more control this time than they did the last time.
We definitely are going to talk about it. So I just want to get started with some greetings and introductions. So thank you so much, both of you, Dr. Stephen Pellick and Dr. Chris Shaw. And I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction here that both of you are at University of British Columbia. You're professors and also co-chairs of the Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee of the Canadian Citizens Care Alliance and senior editors, and I have to keep letting people in, and senior editors and authors of 2 new books about the COVID-19 pandemic. And your first book is what we're talking about today, Down the COVID-19 Rabbit Hole, Independent Scientists and Physicians Unmask the Pandemic, which presents a scientific overview of the SARS-CoV-2 and related viruses and the effectiveness of public health measures such as quarantining, masking, ventilation. I don't know if it was effectiveness or non-effectiveness, vaccines and treatments to confront them. And the book features introductory chapters to the scientific method, viruses, vaccines, and the immune system. And then you also have a second book, which I hope we have the time to kind of allude to it, and that's called COVID-19 Pandemonium, a pandemic of ignorance, fear, and greed, the capture of our institutions, which delves into the politics, the lovely stuff, the politics of the COVID-19 and outlines the failures of Canadian response by government. I don't think it's just Canadian, I think world over, the legal and educational systems and media. And with over 1,800 citations in the 2 books, they serve as a useful resource to those that seek to better understand what happened in the last 5 years and offer lessons to avoid a repetition with the next declared infectious disease pandemic. It's interesting that we can declare future pandemics like looking at the crystal globe. And we know what's coming. Can someone tell me what's going to happen to me in the next 5 years? I'd like to meet those people. So welcome to both of you. And thank you so much for trusting me to do this sort of a discussion. And I was talking to Dr. Shaw earlier that I have very fond memories of connecting with Dr. Pellick, who insisted that I should call him Steve. And we connected, thank you. And we connected through our Canadian COVID Care Alliance group in 2021 when I was, though I did my PhD in biochemistry, but for many reasons, I moved out of active research. But I was really looking for resources to help teenagers at that time. And Steve was so instrumental in helping our youngsters and their parents dispel the myths, because that all we had in the media was how deadly this virus is and how it's going to kill us. And then we had Steve kind of answering those questions. So it really was, I guess, a lifesaver. So those are the memories I have. And so just to get started, I'd like you to both kind of give a little bit of like, what are you doing now and what's your role both in the workspace that you're in and your affiliation with the CCCA and other things with the pandemic, which is all voluntary that you do. So yeah, please take the floor.
Let's start off, Chris.
Yeah,
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, so I am a full professor in the Department of Ophthalmology and Visual Sciences, and I have a cross appointment to Department of Pathology, and I'm also involved in the program in neuroscience and the program in experimental medicine. I am just getting my lab reorganized after a bit of a hiatus, and that was because I was put on unpaid suspension back in 2021 for not taking the vaccine. And that's an ongoing issue with UBC. And now just begin to think about research again. I've been working with Steve for pretty close to over 2 years now on various CCCA projects, and in particular on the book. And as you mentioned, I am the co-chair of the Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee. And I'm really looking forward to getting back to research. My main area of research previously was looking at toxicity of aluminum and also looking at the impact of various toxins on Lou Gehrig's disease. Lou Gehrig's disease has been a primary study of mine for a while, and that's how I first met Steve. We collaborated on a project many years ago. And it's hard to get back into research when your money has been stripped away and you're building your lab from scratch. It's pretty fun when you're 25 years old. It's not so much fun when you're a senior professor. But anyway, it is what it is. And we're looking at that. Steve and I are looking at some projects together. And but I've really enjoyed working on the books. The books have been really a pleasure, a lot of work, but a pleasure to work on. We have many, many outstanding colleagues in the what we call the SMAC. Many of them have contributed chapters, and you'll note that there are 24 authors in the first book, and I believe 20 on the second book, some overlap. And it was a work of love because we're not going to make any money on this. Any profits that are made from these books are going to go into CCCA for other projects that we're beginning to think about. And our goal really now is to get these books out in time for people to begin to share them with those who may not have been so charitable and sympathetic back in the height of the pandemic, and may help them understand what happened, help them, prepare for anything. As Steve has said, it will come down the pike again. And with all this legislation, they're not passing it just because they want furniture, in the room. They're passing it because they are anticipating being able to use it. And so this is kind of a wake-up call for us that this is happening, and this may be the kind of a shield. These books may serve as partial shield for citizens to understand what's happened and begin to develop the skills to fight back. And that was really the goal. Steve and I are educators, and we saw this as a means to empower people to learn and make their own choices about the things that come down from various levels of government.
Yeah, and so for myself, thank you again for having us on, Sarah. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. My background is that I'm also a professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of BC for the last 36 years on faculty. I'm a very active researcher. I've published about 270 scientific papers. And as Chris has mentioned, we co-chair the Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee of the Canadian, what we call now the Citizens Care Alliance, because we've expanded the scope of our activities beyond COVID. But we thought it was very important to get these two books out. In part, I was not as affected in terms of my professional activities as Chris, because I also run a biotech company, Connexus Bioinformatics, for the last 25 years. And in that company, we actually did develop tests to look at antibody levels of SARS-CoV-2 against SARS-CoV-2 proteins, and developed a test to see whether or not people had been previously infected and had immune protection. And we did about 4,500 people in our trial. But we did all that work off of the main campus of the University of British Columbia. And so I was still able to continue my research during the COVID period. Presently, I'm trying to write up the results of our study. I can talk a little bit about them in our interview, but much of it is also in the book, the results. And the results were pretty astounding. We found that 90% of the people that we tested, even in the first 6 months of the declared pandemic, already had antibodies that recognized the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And we find that those antibody levels were very stable over several years since we first tested them, because this is a 3-year study that we did, and that the patterns of antibody reactivity, people make antibodies against different parts of the proteins in the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Nobody is exactly the same. They have kind of like a unique pattern of immune response. And we found that pattern was very stable well over 2 years. So looking at our results, it's quite contradictory to the initial story that we were presented early on in the pandemic, that this was a new virus, that we didn't know if immune protection would work, that it was very important to quarantine people, to wear masks, to get these vaccines, into people's arms as soon as possible. even though there was relatively little testing of these vaccines. And now in retrospect, we have 5 years of experience, and we've kind of put this into the book so that we've really critically evaluated the various measures that public health imposed or even mandated, and in particular the vaccines, and what other treatments were available that basically were downplayed or ignored, like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and vitamin D. And they pushed instead more experimental drugs that, as it turns out, have their own intrinsic problems. So all of this is exposed in the first book, COVID-19 Pandemonium. Sorry, that's the second book. The first book, the Down the COVID-19 Rabbit Hole, Independent Scientists and Physicians Unmask the Pandemic. This book, it's produced in part with the help of the Children's Health Defense, and in particular Skyhorse Publishing. They're the same ones that published Turtles All the Way Down and Robert Kennedy Jr.'s book, on Fauci. So it's going to get a wide distribution. If we think what's in the first book is pretty applicable worldwide, and we have a lot of statistics from that, but the second book, although it's actually, the full name of it is COVID-19 Pandemonium, a pandemic of ignorance, fear, and greed, the capture of our institutions. And as you mentioned earlier, Sarah, is dealing with the politics. And although we look at it quite heavily in the Canadian context, we have a lot of data, it's actually, as you pointed out, applicable worldwide. And we actually have some chapters that are devoted to the capture in the United States of their healthcare system. So it's going to be very interesting with Robert Kennedy Jr. now running those operations with food and health. We may see quite a transformation, and hopefully that will also come back and impact us here in Canada. So that's a good overview of my background.
That is an amazing overview. In fact, you've treaded on so many holy grounds here.
Yeah, right.
So I just had a quick question. I know Dr. Shaw said that he was almost kicked out of his position, and I don't know how you managed to keep the stay in the boat.
Like Chris, but my academic life is not on campus. And Chris unfortunately was located in a university hospital.
Or near one, yeah.
Yeah.
And also Steve is much more charming than I am, so that helped.
Well, I'm on UBC Senate too, and so there's a bunch of things that makes it a little harder to take me down.
But isn't it so ironic that scientists with good standing would be sort of kicked out for speaking about science and having a scientific debate?
Well, I think I don't think Chris was targeted particularly because of that. I think he fell into the situation where Bonnie Henry had mandated that anyone working on a hospital site or near it had to be vaccinated.
Yeah.
On the university campus, it was not required that you were vaccinated necessarily. But if you were working in a hospital setting, you had no choice.
I should, and Steve was right. I mean, that was the proximal reason why I was suspended, because I wouldn't take the vaccine. My chairperson at the time, he wouldn't hear of any. He didn't care. I had taken Steve's COVID serology test, and I had natural immunity. I'd had the disease. I didn't even know I had it because I was asymptomatic for symptoms, and he didn't care. I mean, he either didn't know about natural immunity or simply didn't care. So it didn't matter. It didn't matter who you were, whether you were faculty, staff, students, the janitor, people bringing in the mail. If you weren't double vaccinated and eventually triple vaccinated, you weren't getting in. And so that was he basically ignored the other stuff I could have done. I could have been teaching on main campus, but no, that wasn't going to be sufficient. So Steve was in a little bit of a privileged position. Having said that, there were strong calls from various people to actually in the administration to actually extend that mandate up to main campus. Yes. And that would have then impacted to some extent Steve as well. I mean, he has his laboratory in Connexus he can go hide in, but he would have been impacted because at the Faculty of Medicine where I was, they didn't care where you were. I said, well, I can teach by remote. Nope, you couldn't teach by remote. I said, well, I can do my work from home. Nope, you can't do that. So you're going to get the shot or you're fired. And that was what it was left at. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know in CCCA we even agreed to that. And Steve, you can update me on that, that we stopped calling these vaccines. We're calling them COVID-19 injections. So are we calling them vaccines or?
I think to make sure people aren't confused,
Yeah.
we call them vaccines, but they're very different. They are
Yeah.
more like a preemptive therapy than they are actually a true vaccine
True.
in the traditional sense of the word.
Mhm.
I mean, the big difference is that these are using your own body
Yeah.
to make one of the proteins of the virus, the spike protein, and it's expressed on the surface of your own cells, and your immune system recognizes it there and attacks those cells as part of the mechanism to actually then develop antibodies later on. And this is hugely different from typical vaccines, where you have usually an attenuated version, like a weakened strain of the virus that could normally cause illness. In this case, most people that were vaccinated with traditional vaccines have very little response. And so the big difference is that, let's say you have a typical vaccine injected in your arm, you might be getting maybe 50 to a few thousand copies of the virus. But when you get these genetic vaccines with lipid nanoparticles, for example, you're getting tens of trillions of lipid nanoparticles that have between 5 to 10 copies of the gene to make the spike protein, whereas with the virus, you'll only have usually one copy of a gene. And then the genetic material has been manipulated so that it's very stable. The RNA is usually quite unstable, so you can only make a few copies of a protein using a particular RNA transcript. But with these vaccines, where we've altered the type of nucleotides that are used with pseudouridine nucleotides, you can produce hundreds and hundreds of copies of the protein from just one copy of the RNA. So really, you're producing quadrillions of copies of the proteins expressed on the surface of your own cells. And of course, coupled with the fact that when you inject into your arm, within 2 days, 76% of those lipid nanoparticles have distributed throughout the body, including crossing the blood-brain barrier.
Into brain, yeah.
Yeah, and the umbilical cord into, if you're a pregnant woman, into the baby. And so really, these vaccines were approved in Canada with only 2 months of testing data and really absolutely no long-term safety information. Now we have that kind of information, and we are seeing that if you take the total number of injuries reported, for example, in the American VAERS system, the Vaccine Adverse Effects Reporting System, this VAERS system, you have more injuries reported, more deaths reported, more serious injuries reported from the 3 vaccines that were approved in the US, 2 of them being these RNA vaccines and 1 being an adenovirus vaccine, than all the other vaccines put together. And we're talking about close to 80 other vaccines over the last 32 years combined. So these are not really very safe products for the poor efficacy that they have, that last a few months at best, and with repeated booster shots, we're actually seeing negative efficacy. When you do the risk benefit analysis, these do not pass the test.
And we should add that the
hands.
government never did that risk benefit analysis.
No.
And that has been a major gap in what the government has, governments of all levels have been saying. They simply have never done that analysis, so they don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what happened initially, they looked at a worst case scenario. They thought that the lethality rate in the general population was between almost as high as 3% or higher. But you have to stratify that. Elderly people that are already at high risk of death, they would have a higher potential risk from dying from an infection. But for people that were under 65, especially for children, the risk of dying was like 1 in a million. I mean, it is so skewed. And then eventually, when you look at the entire population over time, what you're seeing is lethality rates that are probably in the general population, including those elderly people and people with comorbidities, somewhere around 0.1%, which is getting pretty close to what we see with normal case of influenza traditionally. So it wasn't any more deadly than what we've normally experienced it pretty much every
Yeah.
year.
And
Yeah.
that's why, sorry, Dr. Shah, you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, add to that, a lot of the lethality data that were put forward by various governments, keep in mind that a lot of the people who died may have died from some of the procedures that were
Yeah.
imposed, whether it was the ventilation, whether it was the use of certain drugs. And in much of the, here in British Columbia, most of the deaths were in care homes, where people were in very close quarters and
80%.
were multiply vaccinated and ventilated when they went to hospital. So a lot of those deaths may have been preventable, certainly would have been preventable things like early treatment with hydroxychloroquine or early treatment with ivermectin. And those things were, frankly, as you know, were banned in Canada. You couldn't get those
Yeah.
products except on a black market.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that may have contributed to the overall numbers.
disciplinary colleges are still going after doctors that prescribed ivermectin to their patients, even
Yeah.
though there's been well over 100 studies that demonstrate, in peer-reviewed scientific literature, a clear benefit.
Right. Well, that brings me to why it's so important that you wrote this book, and the fact that you and a few other scientists and doctors, in spite of facing the consequences of being expelled and banned, and we're seeing Dr. Mark Trozzi is still fighting
Yes.
the case, and you guys are the beacons of hope. And I hope more and more people will listen to this and read the book. And what I wanted to say was that what really stood out for me in 2020 and the early part of 2021 was that was the time we were just waiting for the said vaccine to show up. But there was nothing that was being taught to people on how to improve their health, how to, if we already knew that obesity and those kind of markers were there for people who suffer more with the coronavirus, then why was that not ever talked about? Like, public health agencies should have been knocking at every door to go and teach about how to eat better, how to sleep better, how to get outside, or how to drink more. But instead, we closed all the gyms and we closed even the outdoor arenas, and we opened the liquor stores and all the big box stores and all online shopping, which at that time seemed like, oh wow, that's so great, what a sigh of relief, we can do online shopping. And so can you talk about the science of fear and how that must be something that people should be mindful of when exposed to messages in future, because it hasn't stopped, and what resources should they consider when faced with fear?
Well, this is really the point of both books. I mean, the first book, we're trying to deal down the COVID rabbit hole with the actual science. What does scientific studies actually show us? And the studies that were used to justify the use of the vaccines and other measures, how do they stand up to actual scrutiny? So that's why there's a very, very heavy science and a lot of citations in the first book. But the second book really shows you, because we have individual chapters, on the public health response, what happened with the legal system, what happened with the media, and the educational system, like in universities. And we see the flaws and the inconsistencies in what they've done. And one of the things that's kind of interesting, Teresa Tam, she's the head doctor in Canada, and she actually was a co-author on a paper. And what they tried to do was to say, well, now that the pandemic has settled down, we can look back now at all these wonderful measures that we basically imposed on the population. And we figure, and as I say we're talking about the Health Canada, we figure we saved 800,000 lives in Canada by these vaccines and by the lockdowns and by the masking. And to put that into perspective for your audience, I mean, that's the equivalent to all the deaths in the 1918 influenza pandemic in Canada, plus all the Canadian deaths in World War I and World War II, adjusted for the difference in population being much smaller at that time, put together. It's absolutely ridiculous. So even now, the government is trying to justify what it has done instead of actually taking a real hard look at whether those things were necessary or not. Now, what's very disconcerting is that with this kind of information going out there in Canadian medical journals justifying basically the measures they took, they're using this as evidence of how effective our health regulatory agencies actually are. And of course, they're pushing the idea that we're going to have our next major pandemic and we need to be prepared for it. So we have Bill C-293, which is actually presently in the Senate. It's already passed with the Parliament, the lower house. And this pandemic preparedness bill doesn't say anything about the plan to prepare ourselves. What it does do, and as you pointed out, Sarah, well, why don't we see in these plans improving the general health of Canadians so that when you do get infected, you're much more resistant, improving your diet, your exercise, better sleep, which will be helpful not just for pandemics, but just in general, right? For preventing disease. But what they've done instead is they focused on I would say two things. One, enabling the various governments to have power to exert whatever plan they think they want to come up with. So we're not actually seeing a plan. We're just enabling and making it easier for our government officials to basically limit our human rights and freedoms. The second thing is that it's very global. The plan is to have something which is encompassing so-called one health, like one world. So, and that's going to be dictated largely through the World Health Organization, which itself is majorly funded by private, for example, the Bill and Gates Foundation, private groups, or China is a major funder of that organization. And so they're kind of beholden to these individuals, and they're going to be pushing agendas that not like from who that's going to dictate to our federal level and down to our provincial level and down to our municipal level. And in this preparedness bill, it's not just dealing with an infection that comes where we're aware of what that infection is and we're preparing for that particular type of infectious disease. It's a general idea of controlling agriculture and basically animal livestock and really affecting our food supply and how the environment is actually handled. And so it is so encompassing with no real plan that's really transparent. This is what's the big concern. And that's why people need to rise up against this and not go along and call out their members of parliament or their MLAs and provincial legislature. And that's why these books are so important, because they will arm basically the average Canadian to be able to see what happened when the government had these controls, and why do we want to give them even more control the next time they engineer a pandemic. Now, we've had concerns about mpox, monkeypox, not that long ago, and they're kind of raising this as a concern again, whereas in the last monkeypox pandemic, it was 97% were very active gay males that got mpox, and it wasn't particularly lethal. It was not pretty, but it wasn't that lethal. And then you have the situation now, influenza, H5N1. They're saying, oh, we have a child in British Columbia that has this variant of influenza, which would be coming from birds, but it can go to cows. But so far, no one's died from this in Canada. And there's been up to that point, maybe about 8 cases where it seems not to be from person to person. It's from an animal to the person. And generally, it's not lethal. But you're hearing a lot in the media about it. And this is being used to prepare the population. And this is what you were alluding to earlier, Sarah, about the nudging and preparing people using fear so they will then acquiesce to, basically a compromise on their rights and freedoms.
Well, what Steve said is very true. And I remember with the whole aspect of fear, there was kind of like trifecta of the agencies that collaborated in that. One was government. The second one, of course, was the media, which went along by and large with everything the government said. I mean, CBC, where I live, the joke was it was called the COVID Broadcasting Corporation because everything, I mean, like the rest of the world, had vanished. They were only talking about COVID. And of course, then the medical profession went along. Medical profession was, shown sadly to maybe not know about as much about these things as they should have known, and they were not critical at all. And as you pointed out at the beginning, people like Charles Hoff and other and Mark Chosey have been punished for actually doing their jobs, which is to protect people using the best means available that were based on years and years of scientific research and medical research. And those three things combined, plus in the world the book too, we talk about the capture of the legal system. We talk about many other things. Those are the things that drive people and are meant to drive people into fear, so they will respond in a way that the government can control. And again, if we see it again, we want people to be aware of, we've seen this before. We're not doing it again. We're not going to let them take those kind of control measures to actually, as Steve says, take away our rights and freedoms.
Right. And just before we started today, I was talking to a few others who were there and said, are we going to be speaking to the choir or are we going to wake some people up? So that brings me to the next question. So what in both of yours mind is this? Who is this book for when it was being written, and what makes it relevant in 2024?
Sure. Chris, why don't you go with that?
Sure. I mean, I think we're not so much speaking to the echo chamber, the people who already have reservations and have come to realize how this played out and the kinds of control measures that were used, essentially in a means of gaining control, not so much because of the fear, the real fear of the pandemic, but because it was a means. And all governments do this, left, right, and center. It was not about that. It was about finding ways to control the population. And I think so. We're really aiming at the people who went along because they were afraid, went along because they thought, the doctors, the medical profession would never lie to them. The government was, whichever government was always going to be truthful. And the media, of course, CBC is heralded as this source of truth and objective reporting. And I think they need to realize that none of these things are true, and they need to be more skeptical. And so it's really aimed at those people who maybe went along because of fear, because they didn't know better, and may have also been damaged or seen people damaged by the vaccines, the adverse effects that have maybe harmed or even killed their relatives and friends. Maybe this is really for them. It's to give them the means to fight back so that the next time it comes along. And I think we're beginning to see that because we're seeing the levels of uptake of COVID vaccines going down. And the other kinds of vaccines along with it. And so I don't mean all vaccines, but I mean the ones that are aimed, Mpox. There's an Mpox vaccine. There are vaccines for, they're trying to develop vaccines for chicken flu or gerbil flu or whatever the next thing is. And so people need to be more skeptical, and maybe these books will allow them to have the ammunition to be more skeptical with.
Yeah, I would say, in this pandemic, we've had 2 sets of victims. We've had the people that didn't get vaccinated because they had concerns about it, and they were basically subjected to a lot of abuse in terms of curtailment of their freedoms. I mean, if you weren't vaccinated, you were restricted in terms of where you could go. We had these vaccine passports, so that whether or not you can go on planes and travel and the like. And then the other set of victims is the people who are actually vaccinated. And fortunately, most people that are vaccinated, their body will recover. They will be perfectly fine. They may have had an adverse reaction initially, but your immune system is there to actually clean up invasions by viruses, bacteria, and fungi that are pathogenic. You have to bear in mind that there are many of these that are actually very beneficial to people. And the average person has about 50 trillion cells, and they have almost an equal number of bacterial cells in and on their body, particularly in the gut. And they have about 7 times the number of viruses in and on their body normally. And many of these are actually have a very beneficial role. Some of them are viruses that attack pathogenic bacteria, for example, bacteriophages, we call them. So most people will recover, but when you look at these vaccines and you see how many people, probably 1 in 400 or 500 people have an adverse reaction that's permanent, that they will not recover from, or it'll put them on a path for future problems. Myocarditis would be a good example of that, where you have males that are between ages, let's say 12 to 29. And we saw with the Moderna vaccine that with your second shot, your risk of getting myocarditis could be asymptomatic, but nonetheless, you have damage to your heart that's cumulative and irreversible. It's about 1 in 2,500 in that range. With the Pfizer vaccine, maybe 1 in 5,000. So that's a pretty high when you consider the risk that they have themselves of injury from the virus. We were speaking with Dr. Peter McCullough just the other day, and he was talking about how he's not aware of any cases where they've had children that have had myocarditis from the from the virus, from SARS-CoV-2, that's caused permanent damage. So this is the big concern, and as Chris would be first to point out, we're worried about the neurological disorders that are going to rise, because you're screwing around with your immune system, and you don't want it to be too active, because if it is too active, then it starts attacking cells in the vicinity, collateral damage. And so your immune system's a two-edged sword. It'll protect you against disease, and when the threat is gone in an infectious disease, then it settles down. It's there still and can be ramped up very quickly. But if it stayed active all the time, all the B cells that produce antibodies were producing their antibodies that they could, and all the T cells were activated. I mean, your blood would be so thick from all of those antibodies and that immune reaction, you couldn't survive. So it's very important to have your immune system very carefully controlled, and introducing a vaccine where you have the production of foreign proteins like the spike protein of the virus with the COVID-19 vaccines at levels that never occur in nature. The immune system has to respond, and the way it responds is it develops tolerance. Your immune system begins to not think like we would normally talk about thinking, but it responds in such a way that if you have repeated high doses of exposure to something in the environment, it begins to think it's probably your own body, it's food, it's pollen in the air, things that you shouldn't be having a strong immune reaction to. So it actually downregulates that immune response. It kills off the T cells and the B cells of the immune system that produce antibodies that are very specific for that foreign threat. So then, of course, when you're reintroduced to that virus at a later date, your immune system doesn't recognize it. So you're more likely to actually get to a point where you get sick. And that's exactly what's happening now with the COVID-19 vaccines with the boosters. The more you're vaccinated, the more likely you will get COVID-19.
Well, one thing to add to that, yeah, I mean, and Steve is absolutely right, but one thing to add to that, especially when you're talking about neural consequences, brain cells don't normally grow back. If other cells in other parts of your body, yes, the cells that are infected will be destroyed usually, but they have a lot of capacity for regeneration. Brain cells don't do that so much. So when you start damaging people's neural cells, you're asking for long-term consequences, and I think we're going to see that. I hope I'm wrong, but I think we are going to see that, and there's some evidence that we already are. And so, like myocarditis, which Steve mentioned, when you have myocarditis through any reason, but also especially through the
Yeah.
vaccines, you're not getting, your heart is not going back like it was before.
Yeah,
It's
and
just
we're
not going
seeing
to.
so many young people, athletes
That's right.
especially, suffering from that. And is it not correct that we're seeing a rise in cancers and like a lot of
Yes.
arthritis people? Like in my
Yeah.
own health coaching, I'm seeing a lot of people just randomly coming up with cancers, and then they're being told, oh, your aunt probably had cancer, so you have to have cancer. And I've had to tell someone, okay, so there are like 50 people in your family who have not had cancer. Your mother doesn't have cancer, but why do you have to have cancer because an aunt had a cancer? But people don't see that. However, I still don't know how I can bring it up, because now they can't do anything. They've had the shots. Some people have had like 4 or 5. So there's, I
Well,
think what,
they
yeah.
have to be more careful now to have proper nutrition and exercise and sleep.
Yeah, that's a good
Sleep is when
point.
you
Yeah,
repair, especially your brain,
yeah.
the damage from, your brain is very active. It consumes about 20 to 25% of the
Mhm.
energy that you have in your body. A 3-pound brain is sucking in basically all of that sugar to fuel it to be able to be very active. And when you're sleeping, that's when you can do a lot of the repair. And as Chris has pointed out too, with the neurons, if they once they're gone, they're gone. And the surrounding neurons have to try to compensate. And so if you have a stroke, that's usually how you can get some sort of recovery if you're lucky. In the heart, like the neurons, the cardiomyocytes, these are the contractile cells of the heart that allow it to beat, they're not replaceable either. So that's why that damage is permanent too. And it's replaced with scar tissue, which is non-contractile. So the surrounding heart cells have to enlarge, get bigger to carry that load. But the problem is, as initially that's protective, but if that continues and you get arteriosclerosis, then what happens is your heart has to beat harder, it gets bigger to try to do that. And that increases blood pressure higher and more chances potentially of breaking things like platelets and seeding arteriosclerosis. So it's putting you on a trip to eventually heart attacks and strokes. I mean, we know for the vaccine-induced myocarditis, there was a Korean study with about 800 people who had vaccine-induced myocarditis, and about 4.5% of them were dead within 1 year of the initial vaccination. And we know with other types of virus-induced myocarditis that the risk continues to increase as time goes on. So some reports estimate as many as 20% of people that have viral myocarditis die within 5 years. So
Right.
we don't know the long-term effects. And as we've said about neurological defects, these things take decades to manifest. But the cancer, we know that all-cause mortality had increased during the period coincident with the introduction of the vaccines, about 10 to 15%, depending on the country.
Yeah.
And we know also that most of the deaths that we have in Canada are due to cardiovascular disease and cancer. And when we look at the excess mortality that could be attributed to COVID-19 itself, it's only about 10 to 15% of the cases. So the vast majority of the cases are not being caused by the virus and getting COVID-19. And what most people don't appreciate is that when you look at adults,
Yeah.
at least 40% of adults were infected, developed an antibody response without having any symptoms. They were asymptomatic. And most children that are infected were completely asymptomatic.
Yeah.
So, how is that possible? Well, you have to have some sort of immune capacity that can recognize that virus before it gets too far to the point that your body has to make a very strong response. when you're sick, when you're coughing, your temperature goes up, you know, your postnasal drip, all these things, this is your body reacting to the virus. It's really pulling out all the stops to try to suspend that proliferation and spread of the virus. But most of the time, your immune system can encounter this amount of virus,
Yeah.
and it can have an effective response, stop it, and boost that immune system the next time it comes along. You know, when you have a traditional vaccine and you get vaccinated, you don't get that sick from it. I mean, you might have a little bit of redness, but that's not, you're still getting a good, strong immune response. It's going to last you for decades in some cases. So you don't have to have a super strong response in order to actually have protection.
Right.
And that's what happens
Yeah,
most of the time.
yeah, and thank you for bringing up that the brain, how much energy it uses, and especially when we are in fear, then it uses
Yeah.
up a lot more,
Oh, yeah.
right? So I wanted to, and you said you call the COVID-19 in the book, you said that you call the COVID-19 as a focus on pandemonium, and that it was a pandemic of ignorance, fear, and greed.
Right.
And many people and the regulatory agencies and social media authorities would call that misinformation.
That's right.
So why do you think our government and many others found it essential to shut out the scientific debate? I mean, science is because of debate. Otherwise, there's no science. And I remember that SARS in 2003, which was way more deadly, we did not see this level of control back then.
No,
So what's
no, and in
happening?
fact, that virus disappeared within the year, at least officially disappeared within a year, with no vaccines, no special treatments for it. And I think there's about 147 or so people that died in Canada from that SARS-CoV-1. Canada was one of the most hit spots, actually, from that outside of China where it originated. And, you know, what's interesting is that public health officials claim that the virus pandemic really started in the mid-March of 2020. And yet we know there's cases in China that it looks like it was even around in September of 2019, right? So, you know, 6 months later, we're just starting to get it here in British Columbia, you know, the gateway to China. Uh, so my thinking is that actually we've been infected by these coronaviruses for the last few decades. And the SARS-CoV-1 virus mutated, just like SARS-CoV-2 has been mutating. And, you know, if you look at the Delta variant of SARS-CoV-2, it was predominant in Canada in basically the November of 2021. And by December of 2021, a month later, the predominant variant was the Omicron variant. So we had a variant that is much more infectious, but much more benign than the Delta variant, and it displaced it within a month. So my thinking is that probably SARS-CoV-1 mutated to a form that was much less lethal. People did not need to go to the hospital when they were infected, and there was a certain level of immunity in the population. And what's fascinating from the clinical study that we've been doing at Connexus, we identified the parts. We actually broke the virus into about 6,000 different pieces in terms of the 28 proteins. And then we looked to see with each piece how strong was the immune response to those individual pieces, so we could identify those pieces that were the most immunogenic. And then that's how we developed our test. But we took the best pieces, and we went back to the genome now of SARS-CoV-1 for those corresponding parts. And then we took the blood from people who had COVID-19. They were sick, they recovered, they must have had antibodies, and we did detect them. But when we looked at the strength of those antibodies, you know, how well they recognized SARS-CoV-2, they recognized SARS-CoV-1 better than SARS-CoV-2. And this is the way your immune system works. Once you encounter a virus for the first time of that type, you favor what's called a clonal expansion of those T cells and B cells that recognize that virus specifically, and they expand in their population. They become a very large percentage of the population of these immune cells you have. So the next time you get infected with that virus, you've got a good, strong response. But also, anything that's similar to that virus, you already have protection, in place. And those are the most likely T cells and B cells that will be taking on that intruder. So that's what happens. So we may very well, as a population, have been, systematically, regularly infected with these coronaviruses. We know that 30% of common colds are caused by coronaviruses, and 4 coronaviruses cause the common cold, in addition to other types of cold viruses. But we have already 4 coronaviruses that are endemic in our population. We get them, we don't get that sick, and now SARS-CoV-2 is probably the 5th cold virus that we currently now have.
Right.
I want to come back, Sarah, to, you asked,
Yes.
and Stephen partially answered, with part of the title of the book is, a pandemic of ignorance, fear, and greed. And that was very much at play here. I mean, the greed factor alone, think how much money Moderna made. And all of the companies that were basically making the mRNA or the viral vector vaccines, they made out like literal bandits. They got paid massive amounts of money to develop the vaccines. They got paid massive amounts of money by governments buying the vaccines. And then they got immunity from any kind of liability for the damage they may cause. So they were in the ultimate sweet spot. So, I don't remember exactly the number, but I think it was on the order, and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, it was on the order of $20 billion for each Moderna and Pfizer in 2021. It's gone down, but it was a massive amount of money that they made.
Yeah.
Okay. So
no
vaccine,
doubled its annual income.
yeah. So no
All the
vaccine
other
in
drugs
history has
they
ever
had.
done anything like that before. Okay.
Right.
And they carried it for a long time. Yes, their stock prices have gone down, but that was one thing. And it was driven by the feed. And who drove the feed? The fear. The fear was driven by the media, which, unfortunately answers to government in a lot of cases. The government controls, and the Justin Trudeau even said it. He made a joke about how, yes, the media does what we tell them to, because guess we fund them. Well, yeah, they do. The CBC was appalling in its treatment of all of these things, and continues to be appalling. And then the ignorance factor, sadly, a lot of people who should have known better, who should have known more about virology, more about epidemiology, more about vaccinology, failed to show that knowledge, because they went along with whatever narrative was being concocted. And they failed across, at universities, my university, Steve's university, same thing, right? They failed routinely. And that's, in some sense, as an academic, that's the most shocking part. And watching some of our colleagues be put on suspension or be fired outright, and just because they actually dared to pursue it, dared to ask questions, and those who were medical doctors dared to treat people as they are obligated to do, to be punished for that is just astonishing. So, it's hard not to see another agenda here. What that agenda is, I don't know, but it's hard not to see it playing out in the background somewhere.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
Bill Gates bragged that he increased his net worth with his investment in these vaccines by over tenfold return.
Yeah.
So you look at 99% of the population of the world saw a reduction in their net worth, whereas the top 1% almost more than doubled their net worth during that pandemic period. So there was a tremendous opportunity to make a lot of money. A lot of people, as scientists, you say, well, why weren't more researchers like Chris and I out there? We're more towards the end of our careers, but scientists that starting their careers, if they do not have grant funding from government or from occasionally charities, but largely from pharmaceutical companies, they don't have the funds to do their research. They can't do their research they're not going to have jobs.
Yeah.
The
Yeah, they won't
university
get
drops.
promoted. They will not be on the tenure track anymore, at least at
Right.
UBC.
Right.
They're very beholden, and so this is the thing.
Mhm.
They're not as independent and non-conflicted as most people think.
Yeah.
And the government, for example, uh, we have at the University of British Columbia, we're a major hub now for the development of these RNA vaccines. And you would think that we would learn that this is not a fruitful direction to go. Nonetheless, you know, over $100 million is being invested in creating a facility that's going to be developing RNA vaccines and also other applications of RNA technology. Now, the thing is that it's been broken down into four main kind of projects. And the fourth project is to promote acceptance of these vaccines. It's all propaganda. It's all nudging. It's and when you look at anything that's been said now about dealing with misinformation, the idea is that there's nothing wrong with these vaccines. They're great and they're safe and they're effective. And that the problem is that the average person that's not taking these vaccines now, they're misinformed and they need to be educated properly. And so this is why these books are so important, because the source of our material is the scientific literature largely, especially for the first book, peer-reviewed literature. And this is where we highlight the fact that, for example, with the Great Barrington Accord, early on in the pandemic, tens of thousands of scientists and physicians around the world were all saying that we should let the virus take its course in the general population where they were at very low risk, especially protect the people that were elderly or immune compromised or had comorbidities. And that's where we should have focused our efforts and developed the natural immunity in our population, and that prevents the spread of viruses. Prior to COVID-19, the thoughts were if you get 60-70% of the population as natural immunity, then that basically stops the pandemic.
Yeah.
But in Canada, even with 90% of the people vaccinated, that wasn't good enough, right?
No. And even mothers, pregnant mothers were injected.
Yeah,
So
get that baby vaccinated
So
while it's in the womb.
I'm just going to ask people if they have any questions at this point to raise their hands. And I don't know how long you both have. Or do you want to end it at the
Well,
3?
I'm flexible.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know it's so important because I wanted to ask you, what are you seeing as the trends in the world of science research that need to be changed so we can benefit from science and not be subjected to its abuse? Like you pointed out, that the reason most scientists are working to continue this way is because they're just starting their careers, or they're not as established as you both or some of you are. And they just don't have the funds to continue being in the game of research unless a pharmaceutical company provides the funds. And of course, the funds are provided to validate whatever the pharmaceutical company wants to validate.
Right.
And I did observe that. It's interesting that, well, I left Monsanto as a young scientist because I stopped to see any good coming out of it. And at that point, I think I left it because I didn't have any responsibilities. I was fresh out of PhD, worked there for 3 years, and my questions were not answered. But I recently saw that the chief scientist at Pfizer was an Indian woman, an immigrant, and the thought came to my mind. And I know a lot of my colleagues at Monsanto have moved to US. So when you're being paid that kind of money as a 40, 50-year-old, you're not going to go against it. Now you've bought a house, a car, you got kids, blah, 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 and you're just going to keep going. And most of these people in the science are unfortunately the ones that have been paid. I mean, I was paid a lot of money as a young scientist at Monsanto, but it didn't bother me then. I don't know what I would have done if it was now after I was married, maybe the same thing. But I really just want to know that what do people need to know when they're told it's backed by science? How can people not do something just because there are some studies and published papers for an experiment?
Well, it's become very clear over the last few years. It was even we were seeing it even before COVID-19 that they were putting the words science says or scientists say or the experts say as if this kind of this magical thing. If someone in this priesthood says this thing, it must be true, right? And you heard a lot of comments like, I believe in the science. I trust the science, and the science is settled is my favorite. And these are not statements of science. And we actually have devoted a chapter in the book, a very good chapter, to looking at what science is and isn't. Because when you say, the science is settled, you're making a statement of faith. You're not making a statement of science. It's completely a nonsensical statement from a scientific perspective. So there's been kind of this general trend to convince people that once you have your experts who are saying these things, absolutely it must be true, and you must be a neo-Luddite, and you just want to kill grandma if you disagree. But the way they get, they say, well, we have consensus that a certain thing is true. But you get consensus by not listening to people like me or Steve, and not acknowledging the McCullochs and the Malones and the dozens of other scientists, hundreds of other scientists who say something different. So you achieve consensus by eliminating anyone who disagrees. And that's largely what's been done. And so we need to go back to where science was more objective, where criticisms of scientific procedures and experiments and papers were the norm, not the exception, and where people are a lot more critical and are trained to be a lot more critical. So they recognize where it's going astray, and it's, where it's becoming, deviating into cult religion versus the actual profession of science.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought this religion, because I did have a question. It almost sounds like the New Age church now. And to me, the marker was that fear. Science should not ever lead me to fear anything, right? So I guess, I don't know, you can talk about that what should be some of the red flags for people to say, oh, that's not science?
Well, as Chris has pointed out, I mean, the way science works is there's a constant debate and discussion, and you're trying to disprove what people believe. Your experiments are actually designed not to prove something, they're actually designed to disprove something, because as you do more of these experiments, you have a bit more faith that your hypothesis is correct. But it's not like mathematics,
No.
where you have proofs that, the way these work, they're absolutes. Science is messy, and especially biology is particularly messy. We don't have all the facts. We try to assemble as much information as we can, from the results from experiments that we do and observation, and we form hypotheses for how things work. And to come up with pronouncements, with only 2 months of testing data for like phase 3 clinical trials with the COVID-19 vaccines, to announce that these are, perfectly safe and perfectly effective. Basically, as time went on, we learned that they were less and less effective. And we also learned that they're less and less safe. And that's a consequence of the accumulation of more information as time goes on. But the guinea pigs, we're people. One of my favorite cartoons, where a bunch of lab rats talking to each other and saying, "Well, I wouldn't take it yet. It hasn't been tested in humans enough." Right?
As now.
Yeah. So we are the guinea pigs. We're the mice. I mean, one of the things that was astounding was, one of the people that was on the panel for approval for the COVID-19 vaccines for children basically said, well, we don't have any data, so we should release it and start to get some data. I mean, this is to the general population. The whole point of clinical studies is to take a defined population, and people should understand that those clinical studies initially were done with healthy people, not with children, not with pregnant mothers, and very few people that were over 65 years of age. And so, with these healthy people being tested, that is what we normally would call a phase 1 study, not a phase 3 study. In a phase 3 study, you're actually giving your treatment to someone who has a disease or a very high risk of the disease, and then you're following that intervention is making a statistical difference. But in phase 1 studies, you're giving your treatment to healthy people. So what we call phase 3 studies are actually phase 1 studies in the case of these
So
vaccines.
we have a question here. So
Yeah.
go ahead, Adnan, ask your question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Sarah, for hosting this, and thank you, Dr. Steve and Chris, for coming here and being interviewed and enlightening us. My question is, I heard that you talked to Chris McCullough, so I expect you've been on the podcast and network thing, Stumping the Two Books. And that's, like you had said earlier, preaching to the choir. What has been any effort to preach to the, okay, I'm going to say it, the heretics, if we're going to use religious terms here. CNN is just constantly saying those misinformation. 3, 4, 6 weeks ago, roughly, they brought on the Surgeon General from the US. Was the clip from 2021 was shown where he was saying, thou shalt take the vaccine, because if you deny it, then you're a denier and you're misinforming people and all that type of stuff. And so 6 weeks ago on a CNN panel, they played that clip, and the CNN panel said, well, what else was he supposed to do? He was telling the truth at the time. And anybody
truth doesn't change with time, does it?
No, exactly, right. So again, they repeated that same refrain. Anybody denying what Swami said, the Surgeon General said, is still misinformed, is still spreading mistruths. Even though, and RFK, we all think RFK is going to do something. I mean, it'll be a while before he can, if he can do anything. But they're just constantly on his case of he's spreading misinformation, he's killing people by not allowing all of this stuff. So, what has your experience been to get out of the choir and try and get into the mainstream and say, guys, we got to take another look at this?
Right.
Thank you.
That's an excellent question, and it's the reason why we created these books to basically arm lawyers who are dealing with court cases related to COVID-19 right now. I mean, I've been an expert witness in about 24 cases, and the biggest problem we face is what's called judicial notice. We talk about this a little bit in the second book, COVID-19 Pandemonium. And what's happened, about 19 out of 20 cases in the courts, the judge has basically deferred to, and this is called judicial notice, like I said. This is the idea that water is wet, the sky is blue, and we don't need to talk about these things in court. And so the idea was that, well, if Health Canada says this, it must be true. And in court, in fact, if you have an expert witness, you have to be able to cross-examine that individual to make sure that what they're saying stands up to scrutiny, in a court of law. And of course, if you have something published on a public health website, you don't know who wrote that. Could be AI, for all you know, and how's that programmed. So there's actually not an accountability directly from public health. And of course, we can challenge a lot of what public health has said, because when we have the data, it doesn't jive with what they pronounce. And what they say, as pointed out, changes with time. These COVID-19 vaccines initially were safe and very effective. If you took it, you would not get COVID again. Then, of course, we learned that if you get infected, and your risk of getting infected is actually higher when you're vaccinated than if you're not, believe it or not, because most people, again, the data was kind of skewed, because if you were vaccinated and you got COVID-19 for the first time, after your first shot, within 3 weeks, you were considered unvaccinated. And if it was the second shot, where theoretically you should have already had some immune response, the first 2 weeks you were considered only having one shot, not 2 shots. So what ends up happening is that data gets lumped in with unvaccinated people. And when you're getting that first shot, your immune system, if you've already got natural immunity, which most people had by the time a year had transpired, they were already having their immune system diverted from the lungs and the upper airways, nasopharynx passages. Instead of fighting the virus when a pandemic wave was there at the source where it was going to come in and leave, the immune system was distracted and moving to where this spike protein is being produced throughout the rest of your body. So you actually, when you look at the data from the Alberta Health, where they track this, you found that with each day in the first 7 days, the risk of getting COVID-19 increased. And then it stabilized for a couple of days, and then it dropped as the person's antibody levels started to rise in response to that vaccine shot. So, but that data is lumped in with the people that were unvaccinated. Now we have pretty good data. The Cleveland Clinic, they tested 51,000 healthcare workers across the 200 hospitals in their network. And what they found was that the more that the people were vaccinated, and this is in September of 2022, I believe, they found that the more they were vaccinated, up to 4 shots, the higher the risk of getting COVID-19.
Right.
And the unvaccinated had the lowest risk, probably because they had the most intact natural immune system that was not being compromised by the booster shots.
Right.
So, and we understand the mechanisms of how this happens with the conversion of the IgG classes. Classes 1 and 3 are very pro-inflammatory, and they're the kind that you get that are going to be protective against an infection when you're first exposed to, in this case, the vaccine. But with your third shot, you get a switching of the classes to IG1 and IG3 to IG2 and IG4. And IG4 is anti-inflammatory. It actually downregulates the rest of your immune response that would normally be triggering it to recognize and attack the virus. It actually suppresses that immunity and you develop tolerance. So we understand the mechanisms of how this happened. Everything actually makes perfect sense when you have an understanding of immunology and you see what we're doing here. And now we see the consequences of that. It's quite clear. And that's the reason why most people are not getting vaccinated now. They recognize they don't get the protection. They're learning from books like, what we've been producing and articles that it's not so clear cut.
Well, we would hope so, because we are still seeing a lot of people masking, and people are still telling me, well, a lot of people died, you see, in the COVID-19 years. And I just asked them, do you know anybody who died at home? And seriously, everybody knows that everyone who died in the hospital. So I think there is another question I'm going to ask, but another way of discerning whether this is really science is to follow the money and see who is talking. Because with you, both of you, you're not making a penny out of writing this book.
No,
you're spending your own time, even working as volunteers since 2020 with the Canadian COVID Care Alliance. So I would highly recommend everyone to go, and Hannah's there. Hannah, if you can put the link for CCCA for everyone to follow. So the question is, yeah, for those who have been vaccinated, what are some of the health indicators to keep an eye on, and for possible neurological disorders? And I guess, what can they do now?
Well, some people would say that, like McCullough protocol, using things like nattokinase, it'd be in their diet, that the claim is that clips off spike protein that's on cells. Personally, I don't know if I believe that. I do believe having vitamin D, I think, can be very effective. And if you are going to get infected again early on, maybe the ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine could be helpful. But I think the vitamin D is actually extremely important, and you can do it. There are other, quercetin is not over the counter, and that's been shown to be helpful. But we cover a lot of these treatments actually in the first book.
Yeah,
And
including cannabinoids, yeah.
yeah, and things like some of these sprays that you can take if you're traveling to some place like where you think you could get infected, with iodine sprays, but there's other ones. Sanitize produces a nitric oxide spray. So there are things that you can take, but I believe the best is to have good nutrition, good sleep, exercise. That boosts your immune system, and your immune system will weed out those cells that are producing the spike protein. Now, what's interesting in long COVID, the evidence is starting to mount that these people have persistent infection with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Ivermectin treatment can be helpful. Paxlovid, which is very specific for the SARS-CoV-2 virus, seems to actually be beneficial for long COVID, indicating again that you may have an underlying persistent infection with that coronavirus. So this is why you don't want to be reducing your immune system with further boosters. So first thing is, do not get any more of these RNA vaccines or adenovirus vaccines, these genetic vaccines, and not just for COVID, for any virus at this point. I see that the effects are going to be cumulative. So you let things take its natural course. Your body does have this amazing healing capacity, and in most cases, it'll be just fine and sufficient.
And one thing I want to follow up on, Sarah, you asked if the media have the media are asking more questions. I don't find that they are. I don't think Steve, I don't know if Steve, you want to comment if you've ever been contacted by CBC or Global News or CTV or CNN or any of those. None of us have. I mean, all if they do it at all, it's merely to mock us. And they turn it loose to this guy from Alberta. He's a law professor who's made a reputation for attacking people who don't go along with the mainstream. And that's what they do. They basically defame and mock people who have any contrary view. And that's their level of investigative reporting now. Even with all the things that we've just said, even with the Cleveland Clinic data, even with the fact that so many people are refusing the vaccines now. Where is the in-depth journalism that used to be a hallmark? We hoped it was a hallmark of CBC and other entities. It's gone. It is now a government mouthpiece. And I don't know any physician or any scientist who is doing anything along the lines of what we did in the CCCA, who has actually been contacted and asked to give their opinion to a mainstream outlet. It just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Well, I
it's
actually was approached. I was approached by the Vancouver Sun at one point, and they, and it's interesting, the individual you're talking about was also contacted,
Yeah.
Timothy Caulfield. And Timothy Caulfield basically said in the article that he was not willing to debate the subject with anybody, because he thought that was giving an opportunity, a forum for highlighting misinformation. So his premise was that here's this guy who got no training in medicine or biology. He's basically a lawyer, paid for by the Canadian government, by the way, with grants to stop misinformation, where basically he is the spreader of the misinformation. But I was also approached by Marion Howak, who was a CBC reporter in Winnipeg. And she did this was about 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago. She was hearing about vaccine injury from people, parents who were concerned. They reached out to me. I did an interview. Marion wrote basically a whole article for CBC. And this by the way, this whole episode is highlighted in one of the chapters in our book about the capture of the media. And she fought very hard to get this story out. And it was approved ultimately in the province of Manitoba, where she was based. But then it went to the national level, and there was feedback there that they wanted to drop my interview, and that with I think it was also Byron Bridle, and
Yeah.
they had some other people that they wanted to do from a health unit. So these individuals, we don't know anything about their background. And then eventually they dropped the story completely. And so the pressure was coming from the higher ups. I believe that most of these reporters that are out there are actually critical thinkers and they know how to do their job, but they can't do it because they're being suppressed. And in order to keep their jobs, they will go with the flow. And so they're the major advertisers, or government is the major advertiser. In fact, that's one of the other things that's great about this pandemic of ignorance, fear, and greed for the pharmaceutical companies. They did not have to advertise these vaccines in Canada and in the United States. You can advertise, but what happened was the governments advertised these products for them. And if you take a look at the development of a drug, it turns out that a major portion of the cost of drugs is the advertising cost, not
Okay.
just the development cost, but the advertising cost. So they got the bonanza of being able to have, as Chris pointed out, no liability. They have a product that has minimal testing, and it's being advertised by the government and media without them having to pay anything. This is,
Totally. Yeah.
yeah,
And that brings me to what you've mentioned in the book, that it's the greatest whodunit mysteries of all times.
yeah.
And so can you expand on that? And what have you
What's the number
expanded
of
about
deaths?
that in the book?
It's the
Yeah.
number of actual deaths. In fact, one
Yeah.
part of the mystery is we don't actually know how many people really died from the virus, because we know that 7 million people are reported to have died with COVID, but not necessarily from COVID. And Bonnie Henry, for example, in British Columbia, she admitted that 60% of the people that went to emergency, in hospitals in Canada, or it's in British Columbia, did not go to the hospital because they had COVID-19. They went for another comorbidity. And then while they were there, either they got COVID-19 or they had it and were not aware of it. And so many people, and in fact, this is what's really interesting, and we bring it out in the book. If you look at the number of deaths per capita, the number of people in the country, in China, the number of deaths per population is actually 870 times lower than in the United States. So that's not possible. It's the same virus, right? So what's the probable explanation is that in part, in the US, they actually misdiagnosed commonly COVID-19 when it wasn't COVID-19. And there was an impetus for this because the physicians and the hospitals will get paid more from the government if it was a COVID case. The other thing I think that explains this is, I believe in China, these coronaviruses that are most related to the bat. In fact, the closest relative to SARS-CoV-2 is a bat coronavirus that's 96.8% genetically identical. SARS-CoV-1, you're looking at about 90% identity to SARS-CoV-2. So what's happening is, I think, is in China, you're getting these bats and the virus spreading. These are not very effective at infecting people to make them sick. So they get infected and they're constantly exposed to it. It's endemic in the environment, and then they develop antibodies. But some people will get sick because of, their maybe partly their genetics, but more likely, just comorbidities and other factors. So what's happening is you get a population in China early on that actually has a high degree of natural immunity in their population. So very few of those people actually got sick and died. But as it came to countries where we don't have those particular coronaviruses as endemic in our population, and we have a much more unhealthy population to begin with, it's easier for those viruses to propagate to the point where they're going to be sick, and they will spread. And this virus undergoes mutation. But even if you look at the latest variants of SARS-CoV-2 5 years later, they're still 96% identical to the original Wuhan strain from China. So that natural immunity that we have is actually pretty well established in the population, but it is damaged if you have this high level of genetic vaccination going on. And that makes it easier to have more virus out there and more mutations. And so it's actually creating a little bit more of a dangerous situation. The natural trend is for the virus to mutate to a form which is more benign and more infectious. And that's usually okay. But we could have a scenario that maybe something more pathogenic develops as we start having a population that's more and more susceptible to infection.
We have a question. Yes, sir, Roland. Please go ahead.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I asked this kind of question about a year or two ago, and I'm hoping things have changed because the answer was basically no at the time. And that is that especially now that I'm also seeing mRNA proteins, vaccines happening with the animals for human consumption, but also still the continuation of vaccines. And the question is, couldn't a test, like a cheap test, be developed if we had enough resources to do so? That might cost $20 so that you can test the food product, or test the milk, or test your own blood, and have a quick answer to whether you're still having these spike proteins floating around. And I think this might create some kind of population awareness to look for these things, and if they see positive tests, and I'm not sure you will see them because I don't know how long these spike proteins persist. But it seems to me that if it's possible and it was affordable, that people would buy them and want to know what their status is.
Right. Well, I think what you're looking for here is there's two ways to detect an active virus infection. And one is like a PCR test, which is a genetic test. And the other is a rapid antigen test, where you're looking with an antibody that recognizes one of the viral proteins. Could be the spike protein if it's from a vaccine, for example. The problem is that we've seen the abuse of the genetic tests. The PCR test, it's based on the idea that you amplify the amount of genetic material that you're trying to track with what we call thermal cycles. So every time you raise and lower the temperature, you double the amount of genetic material. And the problem is we've seen that that's badly abused, where normally up to 24 cycles would give you enough genetic material that if with just that degree of amplification, you in fact would cause, if you took that same sample and gave it to cells in culture, they in fact would die. The virus would be propagating. But when you go above this, 25 cycles higher, and what has been done routinely in labs is 35 cycles
or higher,
what you end up getting with is over 90% false positives. So that's one problem. With the rapid antigen tests, they're not that sensitive. So you pretty much have to be sick by the point that you would have enough of the viral protein that you would know that it's there. Now, maybe if you're not testing for the virus, but you're testing for a vaccine effectiveness, it's still going to get pretty diluted by the time it gets into, milk, for example, or other products. The other thing too is that most of the time, the things you eat are rapidly digested into individual amino acids and, DNA, RNA into nucleotides. And so there's not as much risk really if these are contaminating the food that you have. They're going to be so diluted and they're not that stable. So I wouldn't see that as being a big threat.
Plus, they go through the digestive system
Exactly.
and not really the immune system. So
Right.
I think, yeah, the fear is.
Yeah, it's not being injected, like you're not injecting it directly into your body as you do with a vaccine.
And keep in mind, if it's meat or something like that, you're cooking it too usually,
That's
and
right.
you're going to degrade it, degrade any particles like of that nature in that process.
But I presume you would do this test before you cook it. You would buy it,
Yeah.
they do a test, and oh, it has this stuff in it. I don't really want it. Seems to me it would have a
Well,
commercial impact on the market, and that would really raise awareness.
yeah.
Um,
Well, I think my concern is that you may well be breeding for more infectious virus. Like, yeah, it's like bacteria, right? If you overuse antibiotics, you will then favor basically a bacterial species that's resistant to the antibiotic.
mhm.
And then if people, if you're giving this to animals, right? People consume that product, it has bacterial contamination with an antibiotic resistant variant, and that person happens to be taking that antibiotic as well. So you lose the protection that's coming from your natural flora that can outcompete that bacteria. And now it's got an environment where it's basically unimpeded, and then you can actually get very sick.
Yeah.
And so that's a scenario with bacteria. Now, in the case of at least with the vaccine, you may eventually start to breed for viruses that are resistant. They're changed enough without having this other competition with the natural immunity being sufficient. You may be compromising that natural immunity. That's where my biggest concern is.
So there is another question here from Hannah. Is there a way to test if a person still has spike protein circulating months after getting the shot?
Well, there's ways of testing for it. People have detected that in some cases. Usually they're neutrophils. Sometimes it's these are immune cells that soak up. Not neutrophils, macrophages. They're monocytes. So their neutrophils last about 3 days after they're activated. But you can have cells that travel through the immune cell that can travel through the system even months after they've been vaccinated. They can show they can still have spike protein. But most of the time, this is very rare. The big concern is if you get a stable infection of your cells with the lipid nanoparticle, and that you can have, well, this was actually highlighted by work that actually one of our CCA scientists that was working on this, David Speaker, working with other collaborators, that they found that the RNA shots are contaminated with DNA plasmid. Now, in order to make the RNA that goes in the vaccine, in the manufacturing, process, they use what we call plasmid DNA, from which you make lots of copies of the RNA, which then gets packaged into the lipid nanoparticles. The DNA plasmids are supposed to be degraded, but what we have found is that they could be even a few percent of the total amount of genetic material. And if those are delivered intact plasmids, then they can get into the nucleus of cells and constantly be producing RNA, which can then be used to make constant, production of the protein, of the spike protein. So this might occur in some people at low levels, and it can account for some of this persistent effect that we think might be going on in a very, very small portion of the population that gets vaccinated.
So thank you. So in other words, the spike protein itself that got triggered by the initial injection, having that stay long lasting and continuously made is not as much of a problem as having the mRNA, the DNA contamination, which could get into cells, could lead into making more spike protein. That's the worst.
But if they are producing the spike protein, it will be on the cell surface. So it'll tag that cell for the immune system to recognize it and kill it. So eventually you clean and cleanse your body of those cells that are contaminated like that. But there may be some people that are immune compromised. where they don't have that immunity to recognize those spike producing cells. And that could be a problem.
Mhm. And then you also said about NAC maybe not being that effective. So if we have like a senior with multiple injections and who's now getting heart issues, to somebody who is, of course, very much in the narrative and believes that the shot is the important thing to do and not interested in any other kind of theories. But what would you recommend for helping the person overcome their heart issues?
Well, for one thing, that's one of the reasons why we bought this, created this book. We know that a lot of people are awake and they know much of the material that's in this book already after 5 years of being exposed to articles and the like. But there's a lot of people that have not seen this material. So this is something that you can give to them to help guide them and explain to them, what's going on.
Mhm.
And maybe they'll be more reticent to actually getting another shot. At this point, we cannot recommend these vaccines to anyone.
Mhm.
Whether you're elderly with comorbidities, we think that you're actually likely compromising this person's immune system even worse with every shot.
Mhm.
So it's a bit like Russian roulette. You may get away with it with a few times, but eventually you're going to have a bullet in the barrel and it's going to cause damage.
Mhm.
So for someone who has cardiovascular disease, it's just very important that they get onto a program where it's actually quite interesting. One of the things early on I found was with athletes. I think athletes are actually at a much higher risk of heart disease because they push themselves so hard in their training when they're very young, and the hearts get bigger, and their circulation is great. And when you're younger, you don't have as much arteriosclerosis. They have some actually, but what I noticed is that the rate of myocarditis in these athletes in the Big Ten, which is actually 13 colleges in the U.S. where they were doing these tests, it was a pretty amazing about healthy people that had never even seen the virus. They had about a 1 in 700 chance of having symptomatic or asymptomatic myocarditis. So that was very different from the regular population. So you may have even people that think they're being really healthy that are actually exacerbating an existing condition. And so even if you do exercise, we know that the rates of heart attacks are higher in people that run than in people that don't run. So
Right.
there's a nice balance there. You want to have enough exercise that you're keeping your body well tuned, but you don't want to go so excessive that now you're going to get arteriosclerosis, you're going to get arthritis, and all this damage that you're doing to your body by excessive amounts. And one of the things that I'm kind of curious about is that we know that the health of your mitochondria that are in every cell of your body, this is what helps you take the glucose that is in your blood gets converted to pyruvate, and then the pyruvate is taken in by the mitochondria and converted into what we call ATP, which is basically the energy rich compound that drives all your chemical reactions, most of them in your body, and carbon dioxide and water. So that's why you're breathing out CO2, you breathe in oxygen, that oxygen with the pyruvate through that metabolic pathway in the mitochondria, the trichloroacetic acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. When you have that going at very high rate, you actually generate a lot of free radicals, oxygen that's super, oxygen that's very reactive, and it causes damage to DNA and causes damage to proteins
And lipids.
and lipids. Yeah. So this oxidation that occurs, that damage can be permanent. And as your mitochondria are overactive and producing most of these free radicals, this is where the NAC you were mentioning earlier and other compounds that you can take that are actually antioxidants, vitamin E, some of these omega fatty acids. This is why these are so helpful, because they're actually soaking up those free radicals. But as you accumulate, if you're very active and you're eating a lot of food and you're exercising hard and you're those mitochondria go on full blast, I think in the long run you're actually having permanent long-term damage. Now, the mitochondria can reproduce, but you accumulate mutations as we age, and the more mutations we have, the higher the risk of cancer and of degenerative disease. So I think this is why you have to have a very fine balance.
So
One
someone really with not a lot of metabolism and not a lot of food and not a lot of exercise is at less risk.
I think so, actually.
Yeah, yeah,
In
In
some
fact,
ways,
the people that fast
yeah.
regularly
Fasting.
seem to actually have a longer life.
Definitely. And so, yeah, so it's really important to note that the free radicals are generated every time we eat food. So the less you eat, the better it is, and a balance of everything. So to make things simple for everyone without getting into the super nitty-gritty of science, I think, would you agree that for the common person, it's just best to trust the innate ability of our body to heal itself, and to provide it the natural material we all need is water, oxygen, fresh air, getting outside, sleeping on time, eating healthy food, not junk food, and of course, not being in fear. And for that, we need to read books like this so we do get that unbiased opinion of what is happening every time we are forced into fear, because like you said, another pandemic is already in the plans. So what would be the parting advice you would give? And I think we should have these conversations more regularly to people so that whether they've taken the shots or not, or they fall into the trap of fear that the government will continue doing because that is the plan as of now. So what can we do apart from,
Sarah,
of course, reading the book?
Sarah, your point's well taken. I mean, fear reduces your immunity. And one of the
and your cognitive ability.
uses of masks is to induce fear.
Yeah.
When someone's wearing the mask, they're actually spreading a message that danger is lurking, and they may have a false sense of protection from the mask, but it's still a visual signal that we're in the midst of a pandemic where this virus could kill you. And that fear itself is probably the most damaging of all of this, because not only are you making yourself more susceptible by depressing your immune system against that virus, but even against cancer and other infectious diseases. So this is a problem. And the masks, they just don't work. This has been well demonstrated, for example, with a Cochrane study, a meta-analysis of many, many studies. We have decades of research with the influenza virus, which is about the same size as the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's a respiratory, infectious disease. And the masks were never effective for that, and not recommended by Health Canada, by the way. Only prior to COVID-19, it was only suggested that if someone was actively sick in a hospital and they were coughing hard, that they should then wear a mask. But it was found that if you have a pandemic has already taken hold, the masks are completely useless. And in fact, the data now with COVID has basically revealed the same thing. And yet we still have people, public health officials, that are pushing this, even though the size of the virus is about 0.15 microns. The average size of the pore size in those masks, including N95 masks, is 35 microns. So, you're looking at something that's, hundreds of times bigger holes than the virus is. Even if it's in an aerosol form, these aerosols can go through these masks. And interestingly, if someone's very sick and they're wearing this mask and they cough, it's an atomizer. It actually makes the droplets smaller because they're going to force them through the mask so that when in the air, it's easier for them to go back to somebody else who's wearing a mask. It's incredible. And so anyways, we have a chapter on these studies with masking, and of course the masks have their own problems in terms of reducing your oxygen consumption. You're rebreathing the CO2. I mean,
And the pathological bacteria.
yes. I mean, CO2 in the atmosphere is 0.04%, but the concentration of CO2 coming out of your mouth is 5%. So you're rebreathing that CO2 because some of it, the barriers from the mask, oxygen concentration is 21%. You're breathing out 14 to 16% oxygen. So you're rebreathing a lot of your own air at lower concentrations of oxygen and higher concentrations of CO2. And that CO2 has its own problems in your tissues and in your bloodstream. So,
well, we need a way to actually stop the misinformation.
Well, and Sarah, I suggest, listen, people need to get back to critical thinking. They need to understand what it is. And, they need to start asking more questions of their politicians and of their doctors, honestly, and, holding them to account and, making them demonstrate what they're saying is true, not that just because you repeat it 1,000 times and say the science is settled. That's not the answer. You have to actually hold the professions that have led to this pandemic, make them accountable. And that falls on every citizen. It is the responsibility of everybody to do this. We hope the book will help, but the book alone can't do it. But the book will be a useful adjunct for people who want to start asking questions and going back to their politicians and their doctors and the other public health officials who have led them down this path to the place we are now, and say, look, why should we believe you now? You lied to us before. Let's critically analyze what you're saying now and see if it makes any sense or not. And I think in a lot of cases, the answer will be not.
Yeah. I mean, most people have so much faith in these institutions that have been taken over, right? The WHO and Health Canada and USFDA, they're like the holy grail. So it's really difficult, especially people who've, grown up with that thinking that how can you go against the institutions? So I think it's incredible that you have come out and all the scientists at CCCA taken it on themselves in spite of all the tyrannies that you are subjected to. And I think that's the message I want to give to everyone, that please look at the unbiased, voices, voices that have nothing to gain financially in this. And every time anyone who injects fear, the moment you feel that now you're being pushed towards fear, that's the time to stop. And now we have way more resources than we had in 2020. So some of us had our gut intuition speak to us, and we didn't move forward with being injected. But now we have all these resources, the books, the Canadian COVID Care Alliance website, the FLCCC for the protocols, and somehow YouTube will allow me to post these videos, because in 2021 my channel was taken down when I would post them. So we're lucky that Facebook and YouTube are still letting us do it. So I with that, I would really love to thank you both for coming and speaking at length and going way beyond the hour. And maybe we should start a podcast, Stop the Fear or something. I'd be happy
Maybe
to.
we should.
well, happy
Well,
to
we
come on
appreciate it, Sarah.
anytime.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming, and please keep asking your questions. You have my email, I hope, from the poster. So yeah, let's keep the conversation going. So have a good night, everybody.
Good night,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you.
Bye.